anyways, oh my goodness, it is so nice to be welcomed with smiles and claps because this past week I was not welcomed with that. So very nice to see you guys. Lots of young, smiling faces. First of all, I want to say thank you to Turning Point Leadership Institute. Really phenomenal hosting this, putting this on, as well as Representative Tenney. She's amazing. She's been foundational in the fight to protect women's sports, and so I could not be more grateful for her and for her leadership. There are very few women in Congress, first of all, but more so who are so strong and so powerful. And so, again, I'm just so grateful for her leadership. But a little bit about me. I graduated from the University of Kentucky this past year. I graduated with my degree in human health sciences and health law. I had every intent on being in dental school this year. Clearly, I'm not working on teeth. I actually want to do endodontics, which is root canals. Why? I don't know. But it occurred to me after everything that happened this past year that, dental school will always be there. But the relevance and the importance behind the issue that I'm here to talk to you guys about, it won't always be there. And I saw firsthand what's at stake if someone doesn't use their platform to fight it. I realized it would be a disservice to not only myself, but the past generation of female athletes who fought relentlessly for Title IX. The present female athletes who are currently dealing with very similar situations who feel silenced. And of course, the future generation of female athletes to come, including my little sister. But a little bit about my swimming. As I said, I graduated from University of Kentucky, and I proudly finished my career as a 12-time NCAA All-American. I was a 5-time SEC champion. I'm actually the SEC record holder in the 200 butterfly, which explains my big shoulders that I like to drape in these oversized t-shirts. But 2-time Olympic trial qualifier, the SEC Scholar Athlete of the Year, SEC Community Service Leader of the Year. But really all of that just to say that it's a lifelong journey to get to that point. And none of it would have been possible without the women's sporting category. Like most collegiate athletes, at least, you start competing when you're young. And so I started swimming when I was 4. I'm 22 now, so I dedicated 18 years of my life to my sport. But you start when you're 4. By the time I turned 8, my summer league coach convinced me, she was like, "You're really good. You should consider swimming year-round." So this meant that in 2nd grade, you're swimming 2 hours every day, which is a lot for a 2nd grader. But it really only gets worse from there. I guess I should say harder. It gets harder from there. Because by the time you get to middle school and high school, you're practicing before school, you go to school, straight after school, you go right back to practice. After practice, you go home, you eat your dinner, you do your homework, you ice your shoulders, you go to bed, and you wake up and you do it all again. But no one forced us to do that. That's just what you're willing to do to compete at that highest level. And so I was very fortunate. The recruiting process started my junior year of high school, and to be totally transparent, I really could have swam anywhere I wanted in the country. But I'm sorry, guys, I'm very biased. I think the SEC is the best conference. I see some dogs out there, so sorry about that. But my dad, he was an SEC football player. My mom, she played Division I softball. All my uncles played in the SEC, and so I knew that was for me. But truthfully, I always thought I was going to be a Florida Gator. I took my trip to Florida, and I don't know if I had worked it up too much in my head, but I didn't love it. And so the guy I was dating at the time, which this sounds silly, because now I'm happily married to not that same guy, but the guy I was dating at the time, he was a big Kentucky fan. And so I thought, it'd be a pretty cool girlfriend thing to do if I accepted a recruiting trip here, knowing I didn't really want to go there. But accepted a recruiting trip and went to a basketball game. This is when Kentucky was phenomenal at basketball and wasn't losing to St. Petersburg or whatever school we lost to last year. And so that's what I did. But truthfully, when I went to UK's campus, I just fell in love. They weren't a phenomenal swimming school, but I loved the coach. I loved the team. I loved the campus. I loved the resources outside of just the athletic resources, what they offered academically. And so almost on a whim, I committed. I didn't even tell my parents. I just called the coach and I said, "Hey, I want to come here." And he's like, "You do?" And I was like, "Yeah." But truthfully, looking back now even, I couldn't have been more grateful for my 4 years there, and I'm certain I made the right choice. And so freshman year rolls around. It was a lot of adjusting. I, of course, worked my whole life to get there, but we're swimming 6 hours every day. You're swimming 3 hours in the morning before 8 a.m., then you go to class, then you come back and you swim from 1:30 to 4:30, and that's not including any of the weights, any of the extra dry land sessions or the ab sessions that we had to do. So I think my whole freshman year I was just entirely like ruined. But we came back sophomore year, and I had finally developed a sense of consistency. I started coming into practice every day and doing well every day. And championship season rolls around, and I'm really having this breakout season. I qualified for our national championships. I did very well at our conference meet. But then 3 days before our national championships in March of 2020, that was shut down. COVID hit. And so it just felt like we had trained all year to get to that meet, and we got sent home. And so when our coach first sat us down and told us, because it all happened so quick, he said, guys, I know we're gearing up to leave for this meet, but you guys are going home. I was secretly like, oh my gosh, yes. We never get a break. This is going to be so fun. Because in college, you're there all summer. You have to take classes in the summer so you can be there to train. You're there all Christmas. You're there all Thanksgiving. You don't get to come home ever. You get a week off in August each year, and that's it. And so when I found out we were going home, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be so fun, until like day 3. And I was like, now what? This is miserable. And of course, there were no pools open. There were no gyms open. But I knew I had to, if I wanted to come back my junior year and be in a good position, I knew I had to continue training in some capacity. And so, as I said, I'm from Tennessee, which I'm very fortunate for because we have lots of lakes in Tennessee. And so every day I put on a wetsuit because the lake is pretty cold in April and March. And so I put on a wetsuit every day, and I swam miles aimlessly in this lake. I had a little route where I'd jump in the boat dock, I'd swim down to Johnny Cash's house, which was near mine, and I'd swim back. A couple times I ran into a snake and a dead catfish that would just, not very fun. But again, I was willing to do this because I wanted to be in a good position when we came back. And truthfully, my junior year, when we finally came back, that's exactly what happened. It was almost as if I wasn't deterred any over COVID, but a lot of my competitors were. And so my junior year, this was the first year I won a Southeastern Conference individual title, did some really phenomenal things. At our NCAA championships, I finished 7th in the country, which I was proud of, but I knew I could do even better. And so that's when I made it my goal for my senior year to win a national title, which would, of course, mean becoming the fastest swimmer in the country in my event. So senior year rolls around. About midway through our season, so about November, December-ish, our season is from September to March. About November, it looked as if I was going to get my chance. I was ranked 3rd in the country behind one amazing female swimmer who I knew very well, because like in most sports, your top-tier athletes, you know of each other, regardless of where you're competing in the country, because you've grown up competing against each other. You know each other's names if you don't know each other personally. And so she was seated 2nd. But the swimmer who was seated 1st, I had never heard of before. And this was the first time I became aware of a swimmer named Lia Thomas. And so there were a couple red flags to me at this point. One being, this was a senior, which is pretty rare to have someone come out of nowhere their senior year. 2, this was a swimmer from University of Pennsylvania, which is not historically a school that produces fast swimmers. I know I mentioned Kentucky being pretty good at basketball, bar the last few years, but that's what it's like to be a historically good team. The next red flag was that this swimmer was ranked at the top in the 100 freestyle, which is a sprint, and all of the freestyle events in between until the mile. And so if you think of your Olympic runners, your best 200-meter runner is not your best marathon runner. They're totally different systems. But that's what we were seeing in this swimmer. Another red flag was that this swimmer was leading the nation by multiple seconds, which might not sound like a lot, but in swimming, Even 1 second is a lot. This is a sport that's measured down to the 100th of a second. So to have one person trailing every other person in the country by multiple seconds, of course it raises some questions. But never once did it occur to me this could be anything other than a female. I thought that was so far-fetched and would never happen, especially at the collegiate level. And so, lots of head scratching until a few days later when an article was released disclosing very briefly, I'm talking like a little blurb of a sentence, as if you were supposed to skip over what it said. Lia Thomas is formerly Will Thomas and swam 3 years on the men's side at University of Pennsylvania before transitioning. Just continued. And so I read it, and I read it again, and I was like, does this mean what I think it means? This is someone who swam 3 years with the men at the University of Pennsylvania, a D1 school. And so when I read this, I was shocked. Of course I was shocked. My coach was shocked. All my teammates, we were shocked by this. But we almost felt a sense of relief when we read this, because we were able to then look up who Will Thomas was. What times was Will Thomas going? Was this a lateral movement? Was this someone who went from being ranked first to then continuing to rank first? Which is, of course, not what we saw. We saw that this was a mediocre male swimmer who was ranked 462nd in the country at best amongst the men, who has now transitioned and is dominating the women. And so I thought the NCAA would see this exactly how I saw it. Nothing opinionated about it, nothing hateful about it. The facts of it, what's on paper right in front of us, the statistics behind it. But that is not how the NCAA saw it. They saw absolutely nothing wrong with allowing Lia Thomas to swim with the women. And so it's impossible to speak for every single person, and I don't claim to speak for every single person at that meet, but I can wholeheartedly attest that I speak for the overwhelming majority of us as female athletes at that meet, because I can wholeheartedly attest to the tears that I saw from the 9th and 17th place finishers who missed out on being named an All-American by 1 place. And I can wholeheartedly attest to the extreme discomfort in the locker room when you turn around and there's a 6'4" male undressing, fully intact and exposing male genitalia in an area where you, as girls, are undressing. And I can wholeheartedly attest to the grumbles and talks and whispers of anger and frustration from these girls who, just like myself, had dedicated their entire lives to get to that point. And so that first day of competition was the 500 freestyle, which is too long for me. I know I mentioned I was swimming miles in the lake, but I'm not racing a 500. And so I got to sit on the side of the pool and watch. And for those of you who don't really know how swimming works at this level, you swim in the morning, prelims, you have to qualify for finals, and then you'll come back and you'll swim again, and that's where you'll achieve your final ranking. And so we're watching the morning swims, and there's this girl who's standing next to me who had just swam in one of the previous heats in the 500, and she's out of breath. Her heart rate's high, and I'm talking to her. She swam for Virginia Tech. Her name is Reka, and she told me she was a 5th year, which means over COVID we got an extra year of eligibility, and for some reason some people took it, but Reka did. And I asked her, she's from Hungary, Virginia Tech, and I said, why did you choose to stay another year? And she said, well, I wanted to be an All-American. And so we're sitting there watching this together, and she knew she was going to be close to seeing if she was top 16. She was on that bubble. And we're watching this last heat to see the final rankings. We watch, of course, Lia Thomas dominate, again, beating everyone by seconds. And she realized she placed 17th. And she grabs me, and I knew her, but not well enough for this. And she grabs my hand, and she says, tears flowing down her face, and she said, I just got beat by someone who didn't even have to try. And this is when my feelings shifted, because up until this point, I just felt almost frustrated. I just felt frustrated that the NCAA didn't see this how I saw it. But when Reka grabbed my hand, visibly upset, crying, it changed my feeling to heartbreak. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. And so that was the first day of competition. The second day, this was the day that Lia Thomas and I raced each other in the 200 freestyle. We both swam that morning. We qualified top 8. We came back that evening. We raced. And almost impossibly enough, we tied, which means we went the exact same time down to the 100th of a second. And so I'm not going to say ties never happen, but they're pretty rare in swimming, especially in a little bit of longer events like that. I think our time was 1 minute and 43 seconds and 52 100ths or something like that. And so we get out of the water and we go behind the awards podium where the NCAA official looks at both Thomas and myself, and typically you're handed a trophy and you're marched onto the podium and everyone claps and you're named an All-American. And so we go back there and Thomas and I are standing next to each other, and the official looks at us both and says, "Great job. You guys tied, and we don't really account for ties, so Lia gets to take the trophy." And so I was taken aback by this. How is it so easy for him to make this decision? And so I asked him, I understand that there's one trophy. I understand we tied, but what's your thought process on giving this trophy to Lia? And he stumbles on his words. He wasn't prepared to be questioned because no one had questioned anything they had done this far. And he says, we're just doing this in chronological order. And I said, okay, well, what are you being chronological about? Because we tied, and technically G comes before T, but whatever. And he was like, well, Lia has to have the trophy for photo purposes. You can pose with this one, but you'll give it back. You go home empty-handed, Lia takes the trophy. And it was at this point when I realized I was done waiting for someone else to speak out. Because, up until this point, of course, I knew the unfair competition was wrong. I knew the locker room aspect was wrong. But when this official reduced everything that I had worked, again, my entire life for, down to a photo op, to validate the feelings of a male, that's when I'd had enough. Because up until this point, I was waiting for someone else to do it, someone else to speak out, whether it was another swimmer or a coach or a parent, someone within the NCAA, someone with some kind of political power, someone who is supposed to be protecting us, to protect us. But that's not what we were seeing, and so it kind of hit me really like all at once. If we as female athletes aren't willing to stick up for ourselves, how can we expect someone else to stick up for us? And so that's kind of what thrusted me into this position. And I didn't really touch on what happened at finals of the 500 freestyle. I kind of skipped over that. But that evening, the first day of competition, we're going back, Lia Thomas won a national title, beating out U.S. Olympians, 3 U.S. Olympians, beating out American record holders, the most impressive female swimmers this country has ever seen, again by seconds. Even Thomas's time last year would have beat everyone in the country by multiple seconds again this year. But there's a couple pieces I want to touch on about this meet. I know I mentioned the locker rooms, but I'm going to give you guys a full visual of exactly what we dealt with. First of all, we were not forewarned that we would be sharing this changing space. No one told us this would be the arrangement. There was no one asked for our consent. We did not give our consent. And so I can't even express to you. First, let me set the scene, actually, of a swimming locker room, so you get it. These locker rooms, it's not a place of modesty, shall we say. You're putting on these suits that look like they fit an infant. They're so tiny. It takes about 15 minutes to put on. Your nail beds are bleeding by the end of it because you're tucking and pulling and poking and prodding all of your skin rolls into these suits. They're so tiny, it's miserable. But 15 minutes to put on, 15 minutes of which you're fully exposed. But growing up a swimmer, no locker room is comfortable, but you almost become comfortable in a sense of being vulnerable in that environment. You have no other choice, really. It's also a place of chatter. You get to see your friends from all over the country who you haven't seen all year. It's buzzing, it's laughter. But I can't even tell you the dead silence that was so loud. The silence that was so loud, really. When you are undressing, goes quiet, you turn around, and there's someone towering over everyone else in the locker room, drops the clothes, and is fully intact with male parts. This felt like a feeling of course it's awkward and embarrassing and uncomfortable, but it felt like just belittling. It felt like betrayal. That's the word I like to use. It felt like betrayal. And so I immediately left the locker room. And I went up to one of the officials on the pool deck and I said, look, I know the guidelines that were put in place for the competition. It was 1 year of hormone suppression. But what are the guidelines for the locker room? And he said, word for word, oh, we actually got around this by making the locker rooms unisex. So I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, unisex. Okay, so that means any man could have walked into our locker room? And bare minimum, we were not forewarned? No one told us? Bare minimum could have told us. And we could have made other arrangements for ourselves. This meant a coach could have walked in, an official, any male on that pool deck, not just a self-identifying female. Another piece I want to touch on about this meet that a lot of the media hasn't covered. At this same meet where we had Lia Thomas, who was, of course, transitioning from male to female, we had another athlete who was transitioning, competing. But this athlete was transitioning from female to male. Was formerly Izzy, now goes by the name Isaac, uses he, him pronouns, fully identifies as a male, had a double mastectomy, swam only in a Speedo. But I say this because if we were basing this off gender identity, then why did we have someone who identified as a male competing with the women? And I can answer that question. It's because Isaac never would have been able to compete with the men, which proves how this whole thing puts the women's category at jeopardy, not the men's category. Isaac now is competing with the men because I believe Isaac has started taking testosterone. Isaac was an All-American female. Top 5, I believe, maybe top 6 in the country in the 100 freestyle. But now finishes nearly dead last every single meet. The one meet I watched of Isaac's this past year, and I don't say this to be funny, I don't say this to be anything other than truthful. The only swimmer I saw Isaac beat was a swimmer with one arm, a male swimmer with one arm. But I say this again because it proves how the women's category is at jeopardy. We don't see very many trans men or biological females competing in the men's category and being successful, especially at the elite level. But all this happened, and I thought to myself, maybe these rules were put in place a long time ago, and it was sprung upon the NCAA. They didn't have time to really figure out rules that would accommodate this, and so maybe they'll revisit these rules, they'll fix it. It was just a one-off, it won't happen again. And I started doing some research, and I saw that the rules that were in place, that they followed, were put in place in 2010. So I was like, oh, this was 12 years ago. We have more science now. We have more evidence that shows us 1 year of hormone suppression is not enough to mitigate male advantage. They'll fix it. A few weeks after this meet, I got an email from my university alerting me that I was nominated for NCAA Woman of the Year, which is the highest collegiate honor for a female athlete. It's something that not only encompasses your athletic achievement, but also your dedication to your service and your academic success. And so I was so honored when I got this award. At Kentucky, we had the #1 WNBA draft pick, Ryan Howard. We had Abby Steiner, who's breaking world records in track and field. We had a national championship rifle team, a national championship volleyball team. But they nominated me. And I was so just, again, humbled until a few weeks later, after I received my nomination, they released a full list of nominees, to which NCAA Woman of the Year was not exclusive to just women. Lia Thomas was also nominated, and immediately the nomination was devalued to me. It was meaningless. And I realized how silly it was for me to give the NCAA grace, because this wasn't something that happened on a one-off basis and they would fix. This is something they're encouraging. This is something they're celebrating. And so I called my athletic director. His name's Mitch Barnhart. He's a phenomenal guy. We had a great relationship all my 4 years. And so I called him and I said, this is what has happened and this is how we feel. And when I say we, I meant my teammates at the University of Kentucky. I said, how do you feel if I take a public stance in saying that what happened is unfair? And he just responded back with, Riley, I love you. I support you. I would support you on whatever stance you took. He said, I want you to speak your heart and stay true to your convictions. He was like, don't worry about painting this university in a bad light. Just speak your heart. I remember him saying, speak your heart. And I just kind of hung up. I'm like, okay, thanks. I didn't think anything of it. I thought that's how any athletic director would treat their athletes. And oh my gosh, that is so, so far from true. And I'll touch on some other pieces of that's what other athletes dealt with, but I realized how rare that is, and that's why I say it's a blessing I ended up at University of Kentucky. And so I think we can all agree that swimming is not a sport that necessarily generates media attention. But at this swim meet, it was unique because there was all kinds of outlets there. There was left-leaning outlets, right-leaning outlets, and everything in between. And so these reporters who were there on the ground, they were desperately trying to get someone to speak. They wanted quotes for their stories. They wanted clickbait. And so your inbox, they would find your name on the heat sheet, and they would find your Instagram or Twitter. And my inbox was just full of reporters saying, hey, do you care to give a quote, especially after Thomas and I tied. And so after talking to my athletic director, I kind of reluctantly agreed to give a quote to a reporter from the Daily Wire. And truthfully, the story blew up. I told her about the trophy incident, and I think that's one reason, of course, too. I think it's because everyone loves sports. Who doesn't love sports? This isn't something boring that a lot of these outlets put out, like the economy or like the environment or something. Everyone loves sports. Three, I think people saw the severity of what we were dealing with, because I think when you hear the term trans woman, you think of someone who's fully committed and has fully transitioned. Someone who has computable testosterone levels, someone who has had the reassignment surgeries, but again, that is not what we faced in our experience. And so this Daily Wire interview quickly turned into going on Fox, going on Tucker Carlson, doing different things, which was great. I felt like I was beginning to spread the story. People were becoming more interested, which is what I wanted, not selfishly, but for the movement. I wanted people to understand what we were dealing with. But I very quickly began to feel like I was preaching to the choir. Every old man who's watching Fox or Tucker Carlson, he already agrees with me. But how could we reach the people who don't agree with me? How can I reach the independents or the moderates or even, of course, people who lean left? And so I began independently reaching out to CNN or MSNBC or a lot of local left-leaning stations, either in Kentucky or Nashville. And every single one of them said, while reporting on it actively, they were still covering the story. But when I asked, would you consider my perspective? Every single one of them said, no, we don't want to give you a platform to spread your hate. And this was hard for me because I watched them continue to use the stories, but not considering all perspectives. My parents always told me, put up or shut up. I felt like I was almost complaining in a sense. I felt like I had been talking about it, but how can we make changes? How can something be done to where this doesn't happen again? I'm sure if I felt like I was whining, I'm sure a lot of other people felt like I was whining. And that's when I started getting involved in doing just that. That's when I started working alongside the Independent Women's Forum, who's been fantastic in giving me resources to go to these state legislatures where they're passing these fairness in women's sports bills. I started doing this, getting in front of college-age students and the community, the general public, because I think it's so, so crucial to engage younger students, to open eyes and change minds, because a lot of, again, what we see on the media is not 100% accurate. And a lot of what's being taught in these universities and through these administrations, which was made really clear to me after San Francisco when they released a statement saying, it was so peaceful. I'm like, wow, peaceful. It's not entirely true all the time. And that's exactly what I've been doing this past year. And so the battle is nowhere near being won by any means. But there have been lots of good things that have been done, and I'm appreciating the little steps along the way. Thus far, there have been 20 states that have passed some sort of fairness in women's sports bill. Kansas being the most recent, with 15 protecting the collegiate level, which is huge. I'm actually traveling next week to North Carolina to do the exact same thing. At the federal level, this one's tricky because we have an administration in the White House right now who is actively working to rewrite Title IX. Title IX is, of course, a federal civil rights law that essentially says it prevents discrimination on the basis of sex on college campuses. They are trying to rewrite it to where it's no longer preventing discrimination on the basis of sex. It would be preventing discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So what this means is men could take women's athletic and academic scholarships. They could join sororities. They could live in dorm rooms with women and you could do nothing about it. They have full access to bathrooms, full access to any changing space, any sex-protected space on campus. This rewrite, when it initially came out, I believe last June, 700 and something pages long, which when something's 700 something pages long, there's clearly going to be something that's intertangled in there that they don't want people to see. So I thumbed through it a little bit, looked at some of the verbiage, and in this new rewrite, it's actually considered sexual harassment if you misgender someone, but not sexual harassment for someone of the opposite sex to be parading around your locker room, exposing their opposite genitalia. But there are things being done to combat this. Representative Tenney, I know I'm certain she probably spoke to this. I couldn't hear behind the door. But the Stubbe bill was filed on the House side and is supposed to be heard next week, I believe Tuesday on the floor. Senator Tuberville, he's introduced a similar bill on the Senate side, again, to uphold Title IX, which are great things. More good things that have been done. I'm sure some of you saw the World Athletics guidelines that have come out in the past few weeks. This is essentially the international governing body of track and field, and they have said that if you've gone through male puberty, you cannot compete with the women, which is great. They followed FINA's guidelines, which is the international, essentially the equivalent for swimming, which this is what prevented Lia Thomas from taking an Olympic spot from a female. And I want to add, I have no animosity towards Lia Thomas. Lia was just following the rules. But in an interview after all of this, Lia came out and said that they would do whatever it took to take a women's spot in the Olympic team. And so while I have no animosity towards Thomas, I do believe that shows an utter disregard for women and utter selfishness. But anyways, that FINA ruling prevented that. I know I touched on being nominated for NCAA Woman of the Year, and I want to kind of mention some of the silencing pieces that have gone into this whole thing. And so after I was nominated for this award, they had a big convention in San Antonio where they were going to honor their Woman of the Year. They were going to name and honor their Woman of the Year. And so I went to San Antonio. We actually formed like a coalition of groups, both, again, left-leaning and right-leaning, which is pretty powerful to unify over something like this. And we went down there, but it was not in support. We went there and we were able to hand the NCAA directly, hand-to-hand, a petition with nearly 11,000 signatures demanding that they stop discriminating on the basis of sex. And we also presented them with a legal demand letter saying if they don't stop doing that, there will be legal action taken. And this, at this point, was the furthest anyone had gotten to directly corresponding with the NCAA, because I had sent email after email, letter after letter, no response. But at this convention center, at this conference, they had a big room where companies could buy booths and distribute, materials, try and sell something. And so we thought, it'd be a good idea if we bought a booth and handed out little bracelets that said Protect Title IX, or pamphlets that highlighted some of the differences between men and women that are evident, especially when it comes to playing sports. And so I applied with my name, Riley Gaines, very quickly denied. I applied again, denied. I came up with an alias, and they were like, of course we'll take your money. And so we were able to get a booth inside this convention center and do exactly what I just said, pass out pamphlets, talk to athletic directors directly. Every single athletic director who walked by, every single one, every single president of the universities, every single chancellor, everyone said, hey, you know, this is awesome. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep fighting. This is great. And, you know, the first 60 or so, I'm like, wow, this is awesome. They agree with us. But then as they continued, it just began to feel frustrating. If everyone agrees, why are we catering to the minority? And so I began asking these athletic directors, you know, okay, you say you agree, would you say so publicly? And every single one said, oh, no, we can't have a lawsuit. You know, I can't lose my job. I have a family to feed. Sorry. Basically, but keep fighting. So frustrating. Even the president of the NCAA himself, Mark Emmert, who previously, after the whole fiasco of the NCAA championships, released a statement saying he unequivocally stood in his decision to allow Lia to swim with the women because it was based in evolving science. I didn't know science evolved in that way. But even privately, he saw us at this convention center and said, hey, keep doing what you're doing. Keep fighting. And just the irony of that, because he's literally the one we are fighting. But I say this to show the cowardice, the lack of a backbone, the lack of leadership and authenticity that these people, again, in positions to protect us, to make these rules, who are on these governing boards, the lack of a backbone that they possess. Because, again, they all agreed. And if we all agreed, we're all on the same page, then what's the problem? And so that's what the silencing piece looks like for the administrators. Even so, that meet was at Georgia Tech last year. I had the host rep at the Georgia Tech meet send me a screenshot of what the NCAA emailed to them prior to this meet. And it said, you are not allowed to speak out in opposition of this meet being here, or else there will be repercussions to your staff. And I swear, I have a picture of this exact verbiage they used. And so that's what that silencing piece looked like. But oh my gosh, I know I mentioned my story from what my athletic director said, which again, you would expect any athletic director to say that to their athletes. That is an anomaly. I've talked to Lia Thomas's teammates at great lengths, and to hear about what they went through on a daily basis is heartbreaking. They were forced every week to go to mandatory LGBTQ meetings to learn about how, just by being cisgender, they were oppressing Lia Thomas. When they were concerned and felt uncomfortable in the locker room and sent an email to their administration alongside their parents, their administration responded back with, and again, I have a screenshot of this, their administration responded back with, if you feel uncomfortable seeing male genitalia in your locker room, here are some counseling resources that you should seek. They were told that they are not allowed to take a stance because their school has already taken their stance for them. They were told that they will never get a job, you will never get into grad school, you will lose all your friends, you'll lose playing time, you'll lose your scholarship if you speak out. They were told that if they were to speak out, and any harm whatsoever came towards Thomas's way, whether it be physical or mental or emotional, whatever harm that looked like, then they were solely responsible. And so these girls, they were emotionally blackmailed. They were threatened. They were intimidated. And they were terrified into using their voice. Another reason why girls my age aren't speaking out is because they see what happens when someone like me, very plainly communicating the message, I've really said nothing opinionated. I've shared exactly what has happened. What happens to someone like me when we go to San Francisco and we talk about this? You're assaulted. You're held hostage in a room for 3 hours where you can't leave. They're negotiating money if you want to make it home safely. They said I had to pay them if I wanted to make it home safely. I'm like, are we really? And the dean of students was negotiating with them. I'm like, are we really negotiating if I make it home safely? Like, really? It was abysmal. But that's why more people aren't speaking out. It seems as if I've been a lone voice this past year, and I haven't been. I know I'm speaking for so much more than just myself based off of the messages that I get. But the silencing from the parents as well. A lot of these parents, you know, they work corporate jobs. They're terrified to go to Facebook and talk about this. They're terrified to go to the school board meetings and testify on behalf of their high school age, middle school age daughter. They don't want to ruffle feathers or step on toes because, again, they have families to feed. You know, we just can't risk our job. To which you have to be understanding, but at the same time, again, a year later, you have to understand also that silence is complicity at this point. And so, again, a year since this whole thing has happened, I clearly am not swimming anymore. I have taken a step back and I'm wondering why. Why is this happening? And I'm seeing as well that it's bigger than just sports. The language we've always used is changing. I mean, you have dictionaries, the Cambridge Dictionary changing the definition of woman. It's now somehow offensive to say the word mother. It's birthing person. It's offensive breastfeeding. It's offensive. It's now chest feeder. It's the language we're using changes. But not just that. Look at what's happening in prisons, where you have men who are convicted of terrible things, kidnapping, child pornography, rape, who are understanding all you have to do to be a woman is say, I am a woman. And they're getting into women's prisons, and they're impregnating women. It's happened in Kansas, Ohio, New Jersey, California. In California, in just recent weeks, there was over 1,200 men applied to be women. And that's not to say that all people who transition are solely doing it to win sports or solely doing it to get into women's locker rooms or women's prisons or our shelters or our once sex-protected spaces, stealing our titles, our scholarships. That's not to say that they're all transitioning for that purpose. I believe there are people out there who genuinely struggle with gender dysphoria. But that being said, can we not talk about how the systems that we have in place would allow people to take advantage of the system? They would allow people who are really perverts to see the opportunity to get into a women's locker room and take advantage of that, with us as women expected to be the collateral damage in the process. And so I'll kind of wrap up by giving a few examples, and I promise you I could give example after example after example, hundreds. But one example I like to share is a girl named Blake Allen. She's 14, she's a freshman in high school. She goes to a school in Vermont. And this year she made her high school volleyball team, to which a male also made her high school girls volleyball team. Same thing, they were changing in the locker room, and these girls, 14 years old, they felt uncomfortable. They didn't want to share a changing space with the male. And so the girls kind of nominated Blake to be their spokesperson. You know, you go talk to the coach about it. And so Blake went to her school administration and said, you know, this is how we feel uncomfortable in this setting. Is there anything that could be done? And her school responded with suspending her. And they said, the only way we'll let you back into school is if you write an apology and read the apology publicly. To which Blake said no. To then her dad was fired from his job. To which they announced they were filing a lawsuit, and her school quickly let her back in because they knew they had no grounds to suspend her. One piece I kind of forget to mention a lot of times, because swimming is not necessarily a sport that's lots of physical contact, but in sports where there is physical contact, where you're throwing something, a ball, or if you're striking something at one another, if you're colliding into each other, hitting something at one another, you have to worry about injury. I mean, we know the stats. Men on average have 60% more lower body strength, 50% more upper body strength. They can throw a 212% stronger punch. All of the different things. That plays a big role when you're playing a physical contact sport. I'm sure some of you have seen the recently viral video that actually happened a while ago of the MMA fighter Fallon Fox, who, yeah, fractured 7 orbital bones in Tamika's face. Tamika, who's been a fighter her whole life, said she had never felt that overpowered in a situation ever. Terrible. There's a volleyball player in North Carolina recently. Maybe some of you have seen this video too. An all-girls team competing against another team, an all-girls team that had a male on the team. This male jumps up, spikes the ball, hits the girl in the face. It looked like a rocket was coming at her face. Even months later, she's still dealing with vision problems from where she was jarred so hard to her face. And I want to mention the male's volleyball net the standard volleyball net for men is 7 inches higher than the standard women's net. It's almost as if they're acknowledging that men can jump higher. But another important piece that goes into this too is a lot of women rely on their sports, especially at the amateur level or the professional level even, it's their income, it's their financial compensation. And so there are sports like cycling or like disc golf, which I know nothing about disc golf, but I wonder why I didn't play. I should have, because there's a male disc golf player competing against the women who's taken $47,000 in prize money just this year alone. Natalie Ryan. Cycling, $1,100 here, lost. Cycling is infiltrated with men competing against women. But again, I could list truly example after example. But what this whole thing, the really chilling part of this whole thing, it's, again, like I mentioned, it's bigger than just fairness in women's sports. What's really scary about it is we're denying objective truth when we deny what a woman is. It's as if to deny the sky is blue. We're denying the sheer essence of humanity. We're all here from man and woman. It's almost feels as if we're in this George Orwell dystopian novel where they're trying to make us say 2 + 2 is 5. And again, I've been doing a lot of thinking, why? Why is this happening? And truthfully, I believe my perspective is this is spiritual warfare. This is no longer good versus bad. It's no longer good versus bad or right versus wrong. This whole movement is moral versus evil, light versus dark. We're seeing the family being broken down. We're seeing faith being broken down. We're seeing freedoms being taken away. And I think a lot of it really is truly deeply rooted in Marxism, with the changing of the language and the suppression of the speech. Thank you. Anyways, those are just my 2 cents. I have a lot of theories as to why, because there is an ulterior motive here. Why? Why is it women's language being changed and not men's? Does it feel like this systemic eradication and erasure of women? And I have a lot of theories behind it. It's just probably conspiracy where I just have deep dives so deep into this stuff. But I would love to answer questions if anyone has any questions, or if there's something someone wants me to elaborate further on. Yes. I don't know if you have a system in place. Sorry.
Yeah. Yep, just 3 questions only to respect.
If you disagree with Riley, you get the first question. So anyone that disagrees with Riley, if you could just come out to the end of the row. Don't come forward, just come out to the end of your row, and we'll call on you, and you can ask Riley a question.
No one? Oh my gosh.
Excellent. All right. Good for that.
I really appreciate you coming here tonight. It was really amazing watching you speak.
Thank you.
I don't totally disagree with anything that you said tonight. I think one thing I would just push back on is, do you think that there's any way that trans women can be able to compete in sports? I know we've talked a lot about going through male puberty and puberty blockers, testosterone levels. Do you think in any way that we would be able to allow trans people to be able to compete in the sport that they want to compete in the category that they want to?
So I do want to mention, I by no means think anyone, regardless of gender identity, your race, your sex, anything, should be banned from playing sports. That's a common misconception that a lot of these state bills, when the people in opposition, they say this is an anti-trans ban, they're banning trans athletes. I don't want anyone to be banned from sports, because I truly believe sports are, it's foundational. To me, sports have given, I credit sports for the leadership and the confidence and the security to do what I'm doing now, and I don't think anyone should be denied athletic opportunity. I do believe there's a way to incorporate everyone. I don't think there's a solution that would appease every single person. I think that's impossible. But I believe having some sort of third category in an ideal world, in terms of logistics and how realistic that really looks like, I'm not sure. I think it would differ by sport, differ by location. I think there's a lot that goes into it. But in an ideal world, I think a third category is a way to ensure everyone athletic opportunity, everyone chances for success, everyone safety, everyone fairness, everyone privacy in their locker rooms. Again, I think there's a lot that goes into that, and that doesn't answer for a lot of team sports, but I think individual sports like swimming or track and field or whatever that might look like, I think a third category is a way to embrace the trans community. A lot of people within this community might look at it as segregatory, but that's not how I see it. That's not how I truly believe it would be. I think it's genuinely a way to embrace that trans individuals exist and that they deserve to play as well. In regards to being able to freely compete where they identify, especially when we're talking about males competing with women, I think there's less controversy behind a trans man or a female competing with the men, because again, the men's category isn't necessarily at jeopardy in terms of the unfairness behind that. But talking about a trans woman or a male competing with the women, I truly don't see a scenario where women should have to compromise anything, because even with hormone suppression, even with years of hormone suppression, even if males could get down to computable testosterone levels as women, first of all, they can't. Second of all, it would be extremely dangerous for their health if they did. There are still advantages that will never be mitigated even with hormone suppression. Of course, things like height, limb size, heart size, lung size, even something as silly as men have on average a 40% larger throat. It doesn't sound like that's a big deal, but when you're swimming, that plays a huge factor to success. And so I think there are things that will never be mitigated, even if you were to start hormone suppression before puberty. I think there are certain things that won't be mitigated, and I don't see a scenario where women should have to compromise. But I do think there's a way that everyone should be able to play freely and be able to embrace who they are. Yeah.
I have a question. What do you think colleges should do in order to protect women's sports? We see a lot of politics. Politics in general is just pretty ugly. So
Totally.
What do you think colleges should do to protect women's sports?
Besides from just these administrators being willing to speak up, because that's when, again, changes will be made, is when they understand that the majority, which they know the majority feels, as how I'm speaking, but when they start making it public and there's some pressure on the NCAA or on these other sport-specific organizations to change something, they just won't unless we have more people speaking up. So I think speaking up first and foremost. What the NCAA is trying to do now, they're in this phase-out approach. I think, again, this shows their cowardice. They don't want any hands on these rules anymore. They saw what that brought them last year, and they're in this phase-out approach. I think they're in phase 2 or 3, where they're trying to leave it up totally to whatever sport-specific organization. So for swimming, they would look to FINA or USA Swimming. For track and field, they would look to World Athletics, because they don't want to deal with it. And this is great for sports like track and field or swimming, but there are other sports like soccer or like rowing that have gone the totally opposite way. They've gone in the direction of saying anyone can be a woman, essentially. And so I think what colleges need to do I think the only answer for this is have a backbone, because if they don't, what's going to happen is some sports will be protected, some women, but other women just simply won't. It's happening in rowing already. I actually just even watched a dive championship where a male diver was diving against women. I've seen it in lacrosse, and there's a player at University of Southern California, Syracuse, who are men competing with women. So we need these institutions, these coaches even, to be willing to protect their athletes, because right now they're simply just not. And again, like I mentioned, silence is complicity.
So coaches and athletic directors, or who else should, or just any, like who should grow a backbone?
Well, I believe everyone would benefit from growing a backbone. I do think that the student body needs to get involved as well. What I see so often is, again, people agree, but they're scared to talk about it. They're scared to bring it up in a conversation. I think talking about it in a way that is compassionate, respectful, civil, but bringing it up, having that conversation, not wavering from what you think is right, which is something that I have stood firm on this entire time, is I'm not going to change what I think is right just to appease someone. That's just not how I was taught to operate. And so I think having these conversations amongst yourselves, again, not fearing if someone's going to disagree with you. You will take arrows, I'm sure. I get called all the time transphobe. Sometimes I even get called racist. I'm like, what does this have to do with race? But they'll just throw names at you. But when they do that, to me, a lot of the times, too, it's personal attacks. It'll say, you should have just swam faster. You get beat by cis women, too. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I sure did. Definitely. Swim faster. I never thought of that. Thank you. Or, like, your hair looks like extensions, to which it's not. Or, like, just silly comments that I realize it speaks more about the people who are saying it than it does about me. But it's taken me a while to get to that point. And again, I accredit a lot of my security in all of this to my sport, to my faith, to my wonderful support system of my family, my school. But I think being willing to take arrows and still not back down from what you think is important from everyone, including students, yeah, that's everybody. Should we do one more?
No, that was it.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. Riley, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you guys being here. Thank you.